SSPTV and the Hazleton Standard Speaker present Good Sports with Dave and Ken.
Welcome to the Good Sports podcast and web series. I'm Ken Cara, SSPTV Sports Director, with Dave Seamon, Standard Speaker Sports Editor. Dave, I'm so excited for the show today. One, for the topic, and two, for the guest. I'm not in that order, but it's really three guys from the Hazleton area talking about Penn State football. Rich Scarcella is with us, who works for the Reading Eagle and has been covering the Penn State football team, I believe, since 1989. Dave, you covered them since, I think, 1994 that season. We got a lot to get into today. We'll preview this year's Nittany Lions. We'll talk about some Penn State memories. But first, Rich, thank you so much for joining us today. And also, we wanted to start just talking about your career a little bit and your time growing up here in Hazleton.
Glad to be with you guys, and have nothing but fond memories of growing up in Hazleton. As you guys know, but maybe the audience doesn't, I went to Bishop Havey High School, graduated in 1977, and then went on to Penn State, first at Hazleton campus and then the main campus. Graduated there in 1981 with a degree in journalism. Worked at the Standard Speaker from June of 81 until August of 86. We had a young man named Dave Seamon taking results for us way back when. And then I came here and was hired by the Reading Eagle and then Reading Times in August of 1986, and have been here ever since. As of a year ago, I am part-time, and my only responsibility is covering Penn State football. So I've been very, very fortunate, because I have a lot of friends who haven't been able to end things on their own terms in this business, and to be in it for 42 years is a blessing.
It's nice to hear I'm also a Bishop Havey grad. The more I learn about you, Rich, the more and more I like you more and more, and especially now. I say we're, the Havey grads are a dying breed. When Dave told me his background, and we talked with Fred Barletta Jr. recently, they have this background of growing up just loving local sports. I don't think I was the same way. I mean, I love them, but I wasn't as into it as you both were. Did you grow up with that love? Like, were you going to games? Were you following it a lot?
Oh, for sure. My father was a PIAA basketball official for more than 20 years, and he would take me on car rides when he refereed the old East Penn League games, and when he would referee games in the Lehigh Valley, I would go with him. I was 5, 6, 7 at the time, and so I went to a lot of basketball games. And honestly, basketball is really kind of up there. Might be ahead of football, even what I really enjoy covering. But I have memories of seeing Joe Madden quarterback Hazleton High School against West Hazleton High School in the old Thanksgiving Day game. So I went to that every year as a kid. Went to a lot of Hazleton High School basketball games at St. Joseph's Gym, especially during the early 70s. The 71, they had a magical season. And I was very, very interested in local sports. And I think local sports is really a fabric of each community. I think it is down here. I think it is in Hazleton. I think it's so important to the community. And it's something, unfortunately, that people in our business, I think, overlook. And I think, even at Penn State, who, the people, I know a few people who teach there, and I think covering high school sports is something that isn't given as much emphasis as it should be compared to pro and college sports.
I wanted to talk about your time at the Standard Speaker a little bit, what you remembered covering. I will say this, every time I talk with Ron Marchetti, and he does a sports history segment here, I learned something new. I said, Ron, we're bringing in Rich Scarcella to be on the podcast, and he stopped me and he said, did you know Rich is the first person ever to cover the Marcadium? He did it in the Standard Speaker. I was just wondering about your time in the Standard Speaker a little bit.
I remember that story. The first thing I ever covered as a professional, I graduated on, May 31st, 1981. And that week, and I can't remember the day, I covered the a District 11, might have been AA baseball championship that Marion won, and that Andy Shirkness was the winning pitcher. And Marion had a really good run in the state playoffs that year. So that's the first thing I remember. And I remember covering like I covered that first winter because back then I was the third member of the staff. Ray Saul covered Hazleton, Bill Crooks covered West Hazleton, and I covered Freeland, and they went unbeaten. They won the first 28 games until the District 11 championship game against St. Clair. And that was a lot of fun, and I have a lot of great memories from that too.
We were talking about your background, Rich. I know you were at Hafey. You were a manager on that outstanding Hafey team of '75. Kind of probably fueled that passion a little bit for following high school basketball, following that team along. They were all friends of yours. Then when you got to the Standard Speaker and followed that Freeland team too, you're part of the two of the most memorable Hazleton area basketball teams ever. I mean, if you remember that, I'm sure you do. The Freeland team that year, that was like a magical ride because the whole town was abuzz. 7-8 fan buses from a little town of Freeland going to every basketball game, and that like before that loss to St. Clair, that team, they were convinced we're going to win the state championship that year. But Rich was part of that ride. I mean, Rich was there the whole time, and a lot of fond memories there.
Yeah, I was the manager, and probably that had something to do with my affinity for journalism, because I was the manager for 3 seasons, my sophomore, junior, and senior seasons at Bishop Hafey, and we had a lot of success back then, especially when I was a sophomore. That team won its first 27 games, and then lost in the state semifinals to Bristol down at Hershey Park Arena. And then, I learned a lot, about taking statistics and things like that. And then the next 2 years, I was the one who reported the scores to the Standard Speaker, and not by email, because there was no email back in 1976 and 77, but I would call in the results. And then I would also, I don't know if Dave, if you remember this, Fran Libinati had a show on WAZL at least one season, maybe 2, and it would kind of be recap the scores from the night, and I would call in to give a report from our game that night, and then Fran would ask me questions about what happened in the game, and that maybe that sparked it too, or it fueled it for sure. Maybe it didn't spark it, but it fueled it. Fran was such a great guy, and he was, I think a lot of people in the Hazleton area know that. But that's sort of how I got interested, or how it really fueled my interest, I should say.
So long before the Good Sports podcast, you were on with Fran Libinati, doing that's pretty neat. And I think it also shows, Dave, the kindness that sometimes you might not think of in your busy day at work, like Fran Libinati letting a kid call in and be on the air. You working with a Rich Scarcella in the newsroom, you helping me out in my career. Rich, I don't even know if you remember, the first time I met you was in the press room at Beaver Stadium, and I was so nervous. It was my first time covering the team, and I looked up to you so much, and I said, I remember going up and being like, hey, Mr. Scarcella, you were so kind to me, and it instantly put me at ease. And these little moments in your career that you don't realize give you that confidence, that boost, and then you have 3 generations of reporters from the Hazleton area here. What was something earlier in your career that you kind of learned, and now you've taken that lesson and applied it to your career? I'll give you an example. I was in such a rush when I first started doing this. Get the scores, there's a deadline, do this. And I'll never forget, I was at a Shenandoah Valley baseball game, and a kid hit a home run, and I saw an older gentleman go and retrieve that home run. He was like going down a stripping embankment, and I stopped for a few minutes, and I'm like, what is going on there? And I ended up doing an interview, and it was the guy's grandfather collecting the baseballs that his grandson would hit, and the story ended up being about this, almost overshadowing the game, and that really taught me to, hey, slow down and take in some of these moments. What was a lesson you kind of learned throughout your career?
Kenny, that's a great lesson too. I don't know, when I learned it or how I learned it, but that's what you have to do when you're covering a game, is observe and listen. Listening is really important. Not hearing, listening to somebody. And sometimes, even to this day, I get after a game and I'm in a hurry, I sometimes and I don't want to do it, and I don't mean to do it, cut off somebody in mid-sentence, and it's not something that I enjoy doing, and I realize like, you shouldn't have done that. But observing is really important, and I don't know who taught me this. I don't know if I learned it at Penn State. I don't know in school, or if I learned it as I went on. But you always look for the hook to a story. And you always look for something that you can build a story around. Like, that's a great thing. Like seeing an older man go retrieve a home run ball and finding out the story behind it. Sometimes we get bogged down in statistics, and you kind of get lost in the trees. But that's a perfect example. I remember way back. Oh gosh, I think I was my second year here, my first or second year here, and I was covering girls basketball. And the one coach he's still alive, and he was a great guy. And they had one of the best. They had probably the best girls player who has ever come through here, Wendy Davis. She went on to play at Connecticut, and it was a state playoff game, and they lost. It was I think it was the quarterfinals at Stabler Arena, Stabler Center. And he said something about, well, it's time to put on my waders. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, well, it's fishing season now. Basketball season's over. And that's what I used to lead the story, not expecting that. And then we had some consultant come in and look at our work, and he pointed out that story, that lead. And I think that, again, fueled it. You're always looking for the story behind the story. I just wrote 2 stories in the last year. One just recently, I wrote a story on Journey Brown, and we'll get to Penn State. But Journey Brown, as Penn State fans know, saw his career come to a sudden and very sad end 3 years ago because he was diagnosed with a heart condition. And, was told, if you play football, you're risking your life. And he was devastated. He was on the verge of stardom. And I kept thinking about him over the last 3 years. And then this spring, I got his number, and I reached out to him, and I had a 45-minute call with him and his fiance, and it worked out well, and it ran in our paper a little bit more than 2 weeks ago. And, there's stories like this, like Adisa Isaac, who's the defensive end on this Penn State football team. He was born and raised in New York City by a single mother, and he was the only one of 4 children who is verbal. His 3 siblings are nonverbal, and that's what you want to find out. And he's playing basically to support his mother, who has worked 2 jobs, and his siblings. And you're always looking for that, and that's a really important thing. And I love that story that you told about Shenandoah Valley baseball.
I think that's great advice you have there, Rich, too. It's great life advice, too, to just slow down sometimes and make sure you're listening, not just hearing, what's going on. We get so wrapped up, like you said, when you're thinking deadlines, or, you find so many shortcuts in life, you tend to just put blinders on and rush your way through it. I think that's great advice. Dave, anything else before we move on?
No, I just, Rich has taught me an awful lot about those same lessons too. Like, if you follow Rich's writing through the years, like I have too, you just see how he's able to extrapolate the human aspect of sports too. So, yeah, that's definitely been an influence in my career.
Yeah, well, let me tell you, sir, I've noticed it in your writing. You do a great job of that as well. When I read a Hazleton area softball story or something, and you get the emotion and the feeling, and then we get into kind of and then there was a single in the first inning and this and that.
I will say, like, when I do stories on those teams from another era, like that Hafey team or the Freeland team, back then, like, the standard speaker really didn't quote players at that time, so you really didn't know what they were feeling. Like Larry Sock or Larry Krasansky, or Neil Tranguch was a great interview when I did the story on the 75. And just to get there, it's a different layer to the story. I mean, you're always looking for a different layer, but back then you read the meat and the potatoes, the story, what happened in the game. Ray Saul put everything, and to Ray Saul's credit, he wrote a column every single day. And if you're in journalism, you know how hard that is to come up with a column every day. But he was able to do that every day. He had little tidbits of information, dropped a lot of names, places, and where he was, but everybody read it. Everybody knew who he was. and that was an influence as well.
People, critics, and I don't mean critics, readers, or anything like that. I mean critics in journalism would see that and say, well, that doesn't take a lot of work. Well, yeah, it does. He's making contact. He's putting names in the paper. That's what people want to see, and that's what I want to get at. This whole thing, like Kenny, like you saying, that Shenandoah Valley baseball game. What did you write about? You wrote about the people, and writing about somebody at Reading told me that a long time ago. You write about people, not the game necessarily. The people always come first, and that's something that I've always remembered. And thanks, Dave, for that compliment. And that's what I try to do, is write about people. I mean, the game, especially today, if people reading your stories, especially Penn State, most people have seen the game, but you want to tell them something that they don't know about whoever, whether it's Nick Singleton, who's from our area, or Drew Aller, or whoever. It doesn't matter. And that's a really important thing. It's you want to humanize your game stories. Like I know the LA Times has just announced a few weeks ago that they're going to stop publishing game stories in their print edition, which I think is sad. I mean, the next thing is somebody said you're going to have AI doing game stories. Well, the minor league does do it. Minor league baseball does have, if you can see on the wire, it's a computer driven story. And, you don't want it. The human element is so important in our business. And that goes, again, making contact with people and being personable with people. That goes along with the writing end of it.
I totally agree. I could go on about this forever because I'm so interested in what you both have to say. In closing, I will say another lesson I learned was just losses. I was always so intimidated at first to interview people after losses, and I realized, and I know it's hard, but that was some of the best stories and the best emotion when you saw how much these people cared about their teams and cared about their teammates and cared about what they were doing, came after a really tough loss or something like that. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of tough losses with Penn State and the emotions that run there.
Again, I'm not meaning to blow my own horn, but I guess I am. So 2 of the last, let's see, I've won in the event coverage category. Dave knows it. This is the Keystone Awards. I think the last 3 years, and each of the games I covered last year, 2022, it was about the end of the Reading High basketball season. Then 2 years ago, in 21, it was about Penn State's 9 overtime loss to Illinois. And the year before that, it was about Penn State's loss to Maryland in 2020, which was just a debacle. And there's something about, maybe I like writing about losses, but there's more you could sink your teeth into sometimes with the loss. And especially if you have people like the Reading High coach and kids, Penn State, Sean Clifford, go down the list. They were all willing to talk about it, and they were very honest, and that helped make my stories.
So we're going to talk about this year's edition of the Nittany Lions. And Rich, let me tell you, every year, I think another reason I've always admired you, I have the Town and Gown Penn State Preview magazine since 1994. Your name's so often in there. I love your articles. I love your pieces. We talked about putting emotion and human into it. Your feature stories are always so wonderful in there. I'm waiting to get my copy this year. It's my Bible. I don't have it yet, so I might be lost talking about this year's team. A lot of excitement around the 2023 Nittany Lions after a Rose Bowl victory. I keep saying we're moving forward. I do want to start with something because, Rich, I was so curious about your opinion on this. Dave, yours as well. Everyone's excited for the Drew Aller era, me included. I wanted to take a second and talk about Sean Clifford and say, do you think he got enough credit? How do you think he'll be remembered? I often think he's one of the people who are overlooked. I know people were rushing to the Drew Aller era, but here's a guy who had 2 11-win seasons, won 2 New Year's Six games. I know things always didn't go great, but I think he was a little underappreciated.
I was, like others, I was very heartened by the way Sean ended his career with that performance in the Rose Bowl. He was terrific. He played brilliantly. He couldn't have asked for a better punctuation mark to his career. He ends as the all-time leading passer and all-time leader in passing yards, passing touchdowns. We can go down the list. Was he inconsistent at times? Yes, he was. But I think I think it's hard for Penn State fans to give him appreciation even last year. Now, I'll say this. You can't blame, they lost 2 games last year. Let's look at it this way. You can't blame the Michigan loss on Sean Clifford when you give up 400 yards on the ground. So, and he didn't play that badly, that poorly in that game. Okay. The Ohio State game, as you guys remember, Penn State led with 9 minutes to go and gave up the defense, which played great all year, allowed Ohio State to move down the field in like 4 or 5 plays and to regain the lead. Then Sean made 2 really critical errors. One was fumbling, and the other one was throwing an interception that led to 2 touchdowns for the Buckeyes. But really, the rest of the season, he played very, very well. And I think it's going to be hard for some Penn State fans to give him his due. Maybe in time they will. I'm not sure. But I say this, and I've written this several times. From the day he threw 3 interceptions at Minnesota in 2019 when Penn State was undefeated, he's always fought an uphill. He always fought an uphill battle with many Penn State fans because they blamed him for that game. Even though it was his first year as a starter, Minnesota was a terrific team, probably Minnesota's best team in the last 90 years, whatever, like something like that. But the one thing that I admire about Sean, I remember after the Illinois game in 21, and he was beat up pretty badly. And we were doing interviews that year in the end zone after the game. They weren't allowing us in the media room at Beaver Stadium. And he made his way out there and stood and answered all the questions. And he never failed to show up when, to answer questions, even in his worst moments. And I admire and respect him for that.
That's what I always like Sean Clifford as a person. And I think Penn State fans, and maybe rightfully so sometimes, say, hey, we want the Big Ten titles, we want the national titles, and you can't have moments like that then against Minnesota if you want to go from, as James Franklin would say, from good to great, or elite, from great to elite. And I just admired that he always came back. He had this toughness. They had the success. They won these big-time bowl games. I will say this, too. I don't think there was ever more Sean Clifford moment than watching the Purdue game last year when Penn State comes back, they take a lead, and then there's a big pick six, and then all of a sudden he leads them down the field, and they win the game in that moment. And I thought that just summed it up. You hit on something, Rich, that I think is very interesting, and perhaps we could talk about as we move into the expectations for this season. If Penn State closes out games in the fourth quarter, we might be talking about more Big Ten titles here and that. I think about the Ohio State game. I forget what year it was. They had the lead in Beaver Stadium in the fourth quarter.
And at Ohio State the following year.
Yeah, and also the Saquon Barkley's year when he had that big kickoff return for a touchdown. You have these leads in the fourth quarter, and they just weren't able to close out games. You mentioned last year as well, the big lead in Beaver Stadium. Is that something you saw as a trend that can be fixed, or do you think that's just something that's been happening?
I just think it's something that's been happening. I think for some reason they match up better. They have matched up better with Ohio State than anybody else in the Big Ten, except for Michigan the last 2 seasons. I think the difference this year is that the talent gap is very, very narrow between Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State. I mean, I just saw a preseason poll of some Big Ten writers. They picked the same order: Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State, which is what I would have picked. Maybe I would have put Ohio State first. I'm not sure. Michigan has the experienced quarterback in McCarthy. Ohio State is still looking for replacement for C.J. Stroud. But I think this is the first year. This is James Franklin's most talented team, deepest team in his 10th season now at Penn State. But where they're really good at is up front. They haven't been this good up front on both sides of the ball since I don't know when, probably going back to the 2008 Penn State team that won a share of the Big Ten title and went to the Rose Bowl. So, I don't look at it like that, Kenny, like a fourth quarter thing. I mean, I think in 17 and 18, while Penn State had really good teams, very talented teams, they were not as good as Ohio State in either year. And, we could argue forever the play call, going for on 4th and 5 and running the ball. They thought they saw something. It didn't work. You gave it the ball to Miles Sanders. He didn't get it. Okay. But I think this year, if they go 11-1, which is what many of us have picked or on the beat, I think they'll get a crack. They have an outside chance of making the college football playoff this year. This is the last year for a 14 playoff. I know I'm getting ahead of answering some of your questions, and I don't mean to. but no, to answer your question, I think this is the first time. This year is the talent margin is the narrowest it's been since James Franklin became head coach at Penn State.
You mentioned up front, and we talk about this every year in our Penn State preview. We've talked about, hey, is this finally the year we see the best offensive line since, so-and-so happened or since James Franklin has been here? You mentioned, Rich, that might be the case. There's some big names up there. Olu Fashanu, is the headliner. He's on the cover of, a bunch of magazines. How often do you see the offensive lineman being, on the cover in that, which I think is great. Can you talk about the offensive line in that? It seems to me like, can the offensive line in the running game give Penn State time to develop Drew Aller and also some of the wide receivers who have to come up early in that season on the offensive side? On the defensive side, Michigan last year, there's those huge runs that happen, and the game just kind of gets out of hands. How much was that being blown off the ball up front, or was that not an issue there?
Well, watching it in Ann Arbor, that's what the holes were so big. You're thinking, well, they're getting destroyed up front. Manny Diaz later, as the season went on, you could see how much better they got defensively. He thinks it was a matter of guys being not in the right alignment on defense. Okay. A couple guys being out of position. Okay. I know this. They went into last season with a group of inexperienced linebackers, other than Curtis Jacobs. They're going into this season with a very experienced group of linebackers and a very deep group of linebackers. And they're also very deep up front. I don't know of anybody in the Big Ten. I won't speak for the rest of the country. I don't think anybody has as many above average, at least above average, pass rushers as Penn State has. I mean, they could go 6 deep. So, and James Franklin said a month and a half ago, when we were up there to interview the coaches in early June, he thinks this is the best group of defensive tackles that he's had. So we'll see. I think it's really important, though, to be very good up front. I think the offensive line kind of got a blessing when Olu Fashanu got hurt, missed the last 5 games, and Landon Tengwa missed the last, I think it was 6 or 7 games, because other guys got to play, and they played pretty well. So now they can go 2 deep at every position. And, Drew Shelton's a guy who is from Downingtown West High School, a little bit south of here in Reading. He started the last 5 games at left tackle as a true freshman and did an outstanding job. So I think Javen Williams is another guy. He's from here. He's from Wyomissing. He's a true freshman, was the crown jewel of their recruiting class. I could see him in the 2 deep at tackle too. So they should be very good up front. Will it be good enough to beat Michigan and Ohio State? Only time will tell.
You talk about how deep that defense is in that. I was just, Penn State social media will put out highlight reels of people, and I saw Chop Robinson's highlights, and I was thinking, oh, there's so many great players, on the edge on this line. And then I actually forgot about, I don't know how, I was like, oh, and then there's Danny Dennis Sutton, and I'm like, how did I forget about him, coming in and adding that depth? Like you said, there's a lot of talent there.
Nittany is going to play a lot, and he's a guy. Chop Robinson and Dees Isaac are 2 of the best defensive ends in the country. But don't be surprised if Nittany ends up leading them in sacks. Nittany was a highly touted kid in that great class of recruiting class of 2022, where they had Aller and Singleton and Katron Allen. They think very, very highly of him. Although he probably won't start. He's going to see a lot of playing time. Yeah, he's very good. The only question to me on defense is who replaces Jair Tig Brown at one of the safeties, and that's going to be either Zaki Wheatley or Jalen Reed. Keaton Ellis is going to play the other safety, but Manny Diaz moved Jair Brown all over the place, lined him up at different positions, and used him in many different ways to disrupt offenses. And I think the guy he's going to do that with is not a safety, but it's going to be Abdul Carter, who burst onto the scene last year as a freshman. Again, a member of that outstanding 2022 recruiting class. So, yeah, I think their defense is going to be very, very good. And the only question to me on offense is how good the receivers will be.
It seems like Manny Diaz will find the athletic guy on defense and just say, hey, go attack any way that you possibly can, from what I'm hearing from you, Rich.
Manny is a very aggressive play caller. He loves to attack, loves to take chances. And, they finished in the top 15 or 16 in the country in every major statistical category last year. And, they have all these people back. And I think the defense is going to be particularly strong. Maybe the offense has some growing pains early because of, Drew playing for the first time and having the new receivers, or not new receivers, but if there is one question on offense, it's the receivers. But I think the defense is going to be terrific from the outset.
In his limited, I shouldn't say limited time, Allard did get some snaps last season. What did you see when he was in? I mean, did you get enough of a sample size to say, oh, hey, yeah, he looks like he's doing this pretty well? And I mean, not that we have to, but what did you see from him that maybe gives you confidence or think to say, hey, Penn State will be all right at the quarterback position?
What I saw from him last year were two things. His arm strength is very obvious. He threw a laser for a touchdown in the back of the end zone at Indiana. The game was already over, but he played almost the whole fourth quarter. And the other thing is his poise. He replaced Clifford in the opener at Purdue in front of a sellout crowd, night game. Clifford had to run to the locker room because he was dehydrated. And Allard came in and had such poise. It didn't look like this was the first game of his college career. And that's the thing that sticks out with people, is that I think this guy is ready from a mental standpoint for the moment. And I'll give you a little story. Back in March on Pro Day, they invite us up there and we get to interview the guys who are working out in front of the NFL scouts. And we're standing behind a rope. And in front of us, Brenton Strange, who was drafted by Jacksonville, he's there catching passes from Drew Allard. Drew Allard's there in sweats. I'm standing 10 feet from him, and the ball is going here. And the way that ball came off his hand is unlike anything that I've seen in person. It just zip, zip, zip. And he was probably about 20 yards. He was throwing the ball about 20 yards to Strange. I think he's the real deal. I think Penn State coaches think he's the real deal. Again, let's I know I saw somebody mentioning him as a long shot for the Heisman. Let's pump the brakes there. But I think he's going to have a good season. Is he going to have a great season? I don't know. Until you see him go through the wars here.
Rich, you talked a little bit about the receivers. You have Keandre Lambert-Smith back this year as the most experienced player to bring in a transfer like Dante Cephas this year. Other guys, Harrison Wallace coming in. What do you see from that group this year that could really take this team to another level?
Yeah, that's the question mark. Keandre Lambert-Smith had been pretty inconsistent most of his 2 years at Penn State until late in the season, and then especially the Rose Bowl. He had a terrific Rose Bowl, obviously, with the 88-yard catch from Clifford, touchdown catch. I like what I have seen from Harrison Wallace III. I think he'll be the third starter. And Cephas is a guy transferred from Kent State. He's from Pittsburgh, played high school ball with Daquan Hardy. He's put up big numbers, and he was one of the more sought after wide receivers in the portal in the offseason. So but I just don't know. I mean, I think I still have some questions about Lambert-Smith. I still have questions. I don't know that Cephas. I have to see him, to believe it, because I haven't really seen him against Big Ten competition. And then Harrison Wallace, he's shown flashes. And the fourth guy to watch is Omari Evans. He played last year as a true freshman, was a high school quarterback in Texas, has unbelievable speed. And if he can learn the position, I think he can be a real weapon on the outside.
You expect big things from the tight end group this year. They're very, very experienced there. I think they're, in addition to Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren, you have some youngsters. Dinkins comes to mind. Jerry Cross is another player who was highly recruited. What do you see from the tight end group?
I think they're going to be a big part of what Penn State does offensively. Franklin said it doesn't matter who the best four receivers are, whether they're wideouts or tight ends. I think Theo Johnson's going to have a monstrous year. I think Tyler Warren is really, really good. They both played really well since they were freshmen. Dinkins was a guy that, kind of they were iffy about, but he had a very good spring. And Jerry Cross comes with a tremendous amount of credentials. So I think with Mike Yursich, you can see how important the two tight end offense has been, especially last year. So I would not be surprised if you see a lot of two tight end sets. I think they're being overlooked nationally in the preseason magazines too. Both of them, Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren, and I think they're going to be a big part of what Penn State does on offense.
Speaking of big things, I mean, obviously a lot of big things are expected from that two-headed monster in the backfield with Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. You've got an up-close look at Nick Singleton throughout his high school career, being from the Reading area there, Governor Mifflin. What don't we know about Nick Singleton and Katron Allen?
I think Nick is very quiet. His dad is, and his dad's a really, his family, not just his dad, his family, very nice people, extremely nice people. But Nick has been committed from the time maybe junior high. He wants to be the best. What does that mean? Well, he wanted to be the best at Governor Mifflin. Then he wanted to be the best in the Lancaster-Lebanon League. Then he wanted to, or in the Berks League. Then he wanted to be best in the LL, and so on. Now he wants to be the best running back in the Big Ten and maybe the country. I know the people, a couple of people who work at a gym here called Garage Strength, and that's where Nick works out. And they have told me for the last 3 years just what an incredible work ethic that he has, and that they train Olympic athletes, okay, mostly track and field athletes. And in fact, one of the guys that they train just won a United States championship in the discus. They say when Nick is there that these athletes stop to watch him. I mean, he just set or came close to breaking Saquon Barkley's record for I think for the clean. I don't know weightlifting terms as well, but for one of the weightlifting records at Penn State. And what he told me, he had his second football clinic here last month, and he said he's faster than he was last year. He said he's right around 4.3, maybe even under 4.3. You could see he ran into a little bit of a rough patch mid-season, and then he came on strong. And he and Katron are rooming together. They're buddies. Katron is a different kind of back. They learn from each other. Katron has great vision, has great patience, and another guy who I think is being overlooked. I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if both guys go over 1,000 yards this year. That's how good they can be, and especially with that offensive line and with Aller at quarterback. I think the sky's the limit. I know that sounds trite, but I really do with those two guys. I can't remember the last time Penn State had two backs like that, and it may go back to '94 when they had three backs, that John Carter, Mike Archie, and Stephen Pitts. I'd have to look, but these two guys are very, very good.
No, the offense I think is going to pick up. I think they're going to, I think it helps that you have a game against West Virginia, get the bugs out a little bit, then you follow that up. In Delaware, and then you go to Illinois. That'll be his first true test, I believe.
I agree, because Illinois has had a very good defense, and they're expected to have a good defense this year.
The secondary obviously looks very, very strong, was last year. How much have you seen that improve, Rich, in the past few years? As you've mentioned, Penn State being able to match up against Ohio State so well. They always have talented wide receivers, and Penn State seems like they've answered that challenge.
Right. I mean, there is, for a long time, Penn State has had good secondaries at times, but not great secondaries. Kalen King, if he has the kind of year I think he's going to have, and a lot of people think he's going to have, he will be the first Penn State defensive back to be drafted in the first round. I mean, that's where they're projecting him, and if he goes in the first round, he will make history. I know this is maybe surprising to some, but I thought Kalen King was better than Joey Porter last year, and Joey Porter was very, very good. But Kalen King is so fundamentally sound. He's always in the right position. He has good speed, good instincts. And then you got a guy like Johnny Dixon. Johnny has to watch out for penalties, for interference and holding. If he can overcome that, he can be very, very good. And then they have their nickel guy is Daquan Hardy, who also kind of flies under the radar. So I think coverage-wise, and they have some younger guys that I won't mention, younger guys who are very, very talented as well. Somebody like Cam Miller. But I think their secondary is, they finished second in the country last year in pass efficiency defense. And that's the real barometer of how you play against the pass. I think Kalen King and Johnny Dixon probably are as good a pair as any in the Big Ten. Any cornerbacks in the Big Ten.
I wanted to ask about another linebacker at Penn State, Tyler Elsdon, who played here at North Schuylkill in the Hazleton area, in the Schuylkill County area. He's, got some experience there. He's been a great story. I loved covering him in high school. He worked his way into that starting unit. Have you seen him grow a little bit and work his way in there? There's a lot of talented linebackers. For him to get that starting nod must show a lot.
They went into last season with unknowns at the other two linebacker positions besides Curtis Jacobs. And Tyler Elsdon earned the starting position at middle linebacker and alternated with Kobe King, Kalen's twin brother. And they played very well. Maybe they didn't play so well against Michigan, but I thought otherwise. I thought they had a very good season. And now they have a full year under their belt. They got all the experience in the world. Like, linebacker is now one of the strengths of the team. Last year, it was considered perhaps the weakest link on the defense. So I think Tyler's done a really good job, and Tyler does such great things off the field as well. And I think very, very, very highly of him. I think he's going to have a very, very nice year.
Rich, you talk about the defense too, and with Manny Diaz in control of the defense, it seems more like it's constructed like an SEC type defense. Would you agree with that?
I think he relies a lot on speed, and that's sort of been the trend. Even with Brent Pry, they tried to get their fastest players on the field, or as much as they could. So I think but I think what Manny does, you can't, if you're an offense, you can't relax against a Manny Diaz defense, because he's just going to get right in your face. He lined up Jair Brown. Jair Brown could have lined up anywhere last year. Safety, linebacker, up front as an edge rusher. You didn't know that. And that's what Manny, and you don't know, like when he calls a blitz, you don't know where it's coming from. It's not always from the same position. So I really like, he obviously did a terrific job last year, and I expect the same this year. And if Penn State has any kind of success this year, I would imagine that Manny's going to get another chance at a head coaching job somewhere.
We mentioned special teams in that, Dave. I don't know if you noticed, I'm actually wearing a Barney Amore hat that I purchased from his Instagram last season. Huge, as a former soccer player, I'm a huge fan of the special teams, Rich. New kickers this year for Penn State, and that. What insight can you give us into that side of the ball? And well, special teams is always important. I'm not saying that, but I mean, so much of the headlines go to, Drew Aller and the offense and how good this defense is. You're going to be in some tight games. How important is the special teams going to be, and is the talent there?
It's going to be very important, and you have to replace all three primary positions on special teams. I mean, Chris Stoll was the long snapper of the year and was a 4-year starter. Outstanding snapper. And he didn't have one bad snap, I don't think, his whole career. So that's going to be interesting to watch. And their kickers, Jake Pinniger had a good year, and obviously Barney had a really nice year. That was a pleasant surprise. But they're going to probably rely, my guess, on 2 transfers. Alex Elkins, who's a transfer from Columbia. I just want to make sure I get this right. Riley Thompson, who was a transfer from Florida Atlantic, could be the punter. So they're very important because they could be in close games. They can be in multiple close games, and they're going to have to rely on special teams. And they had pretty good special teams play last year. Singleton returned a kickoff for a touchdown at Rutgers. Kenny, as you know, because you were there. So I would think that's going to be a focus during preseason camp in August.
As we look at the schedule and everything, you alluded to, not that we have to do predictions, but you look at the schedule, Rich, in that, do you see 11 wins there? I mean, is that the ceiling? I mean, if you were doing like an over-under, what are you looking at this season?
I did get my copy of Town and Gown, and I didn't know what everybody else picked. I picked 11-1. We picked the regular season because you don't know who they're playing in the bowl game. I really think, I think the 2 toughest games outside Ohio State and Michigan will be early. Will be at Illinois, and then the next week home against Iowa. Obviously, they'll have plenty of motivation against both. The last time they played Illinois 2 years ago, they lost it 9 overtimes. The last time they played Iowa 2 years ago, Sean Clifford got hurt, and then you had the whole, crowd booing when guys were getting hurt. PJ Mustafer there's his ACL, and the Iowa fans are booing because they think he's trying to delay the game for some reason. But anyway, I think those 2 are going to be their toughest games outside Ohio State and Michigan. And I think they're set up. I mean, the 2 weeks before Ohio State, Penn State is a bye and then plays UMass at home. So, and UMass is one of the, they're one of the bottom feeders in the football bowl subdivision. So I think the schedule sets up well. They've almost in recent years, they've played Ohio State very tough out in Columbus. So we'll see. I'm picking 11. I think they're going to split. I'm not confident enough to go 12-0. I think they're going to split with Ohio State and Michigan and win the rest of their games.
If I'm a Penn State fan, I'm concerned. You talk about that early game going to Illinois at 11 o'clock in the morning start. And then the following week, you mentioned Iowa. You're going to be in a physical game with Illinois and then have to turn around, travel back home, and then come home and get ready for Iowa. Defensively, you know how good Iowa's going to be. They'll be very stout as usual. Questions on offense, but that'll also be a physical game. So playing them back to back, that's going to be a true barometer where this team is.
Rich is giving me confidence. I was thinking 3 losses in the regular season. It was just me guessing really, but taking a look at a younger, maybe at some of the skill positions. But he's giving me confidence. I'll say like a 10-2, and I agreed. I was going to ask how important that at Illinois and that game at with Iowa at home was going to be. Before we got on air, Dave and I kept saying to each other, we think this team's a year away. Are we right in this narrative, wrong in this narrative? It seems like pay attention now. You're saying this is a 1-loss team. This is they're making a run.
Well, the thing is, you'd never want to say, next year's our year. This year, why not this year? Who knows? They have the pieces in place. A lot of the members of the 2022 recruiting class are going to be playing primary roles on this team. And, I don't agree with that philosophy, especially in college football these days where you have the transfer portal, and things can change like that. And I mean, you've got it when you have a chance to get something, to win something that James Franklin is hell bent on winning the national championship. You got to take advantage of it. You got to seize those opportunities. So I disagree with people saying, "Oh, like next year's the year." No, this year's the year, and next year. They're built to make a run these next 2 years. The good thing about next year is that the college football playoff expands to 12 teams. It's going to be hard for any one-loss team that doesn't win a conference championship to get in that Final Four this year. So we'll see how it all plays out.
Well, you talk about James Franklin too. He always, and his expectations for this year, he always, talks about the 1-0 approach, and we're looking at just the game in front of us too. But reality, how much do you think they're really looking ahead to the big picture?
Well, no, I think they're not going to say that publicly, but I know one of the one-on-one interviews that I had with James, I can't remember how long ago it was. He wants. This is a selfish thing. I mean, from a selfish standpoint, but then he'll never say this after a game or anything. He wants to be the first African American coach to win a national championship, and he thinks he can do it at Penn State. And I think they're set up these 2 years, and they're doing a great job recruiting the class of 24 right now. They've really got a lot of momentum going. So we'll see. But I think, deep down, that's what every team plays for. They want to be national champions. And to do that, you have to approach it one game at a time. We want to go 1-0 this week. And that each opponent, like he said, if we treated each opponent differently, then our preparation is different. So then we can't do that. But it's only human nature to think, do they want to win a national championship? Oh my gosh, yes. That's the goal for everybody who plays college sports.
Rich, anything else we didn't hit on you feel is important to the season that maybe you're not seeing, the national media hit on, or even us here as we take a look at some of the headlines about the 2023 team?
Well, this is one thing that I'll probably write off media day. There is still a segment of the Penn State fan base that has doubts about James Franklin, and especially in game situations. And I answer the last 7 years, and including, I throw out the 2020 season for a lot of reasons. Journey Brown, Micah Parsons, just to begin with, not missing the whole season. But this 7-year run, 4 11-win seasons, 4 major bowls, that hasn't happened in almost 30 years. So, do they have a good record against Ohio State and Michigan? No. Michigan record's not as bad as people think. They haven't played well the last 2 years, especially last year. But I think I'm always surprised when I hear that. I just heard it from a friend last week. Franklin, yeah, he's a good recruiter, but he can't coach. I mean, look at the guys that he has had as assistant coaches who have gone on to be head coaches. Charles South, Brent Pry, Ricky Ronnie, just to name 3. And Joe Moorhead, another one. Yeah. So I think he's good enough to coach. But I think to silence the doubters, to convince the doubters, I think he has to beat Ohio State and Michigan in the same year.
I love James Franklin. I love his attitude. He seems very genuine. There's one thing, as we're at our tailgate and we do our toast, we always say it starts with I love you and ends with I love you. That comes from James Franklin. I think he really cares. And also, he came in off of the sanctions, and I think Penn State fans just instantly, the expectations went back up, especially after that 2016 season. You win that Big Ten title, and I think you just forget about where this started and where it came from.
Kenny, I think there's a segment too that of fans, maybe it's a small minority, that don't want to see James succeed because people will forget about Joe Paterno. Well, that's not true. Joe Paterno's legacy at Penn State his football legacy at Penn State is secure. What he did, what he accomplished. Um, I think that's silly to compare what James Franklin, James Franklin might diminish Joe Paterno's reputation if he wins a national championship. Come on, that's ridiculous. But I think there's a small minority of Penn State fans who believe that.
And I'll close with just saying what James has also done to upgrade facilities, to bring Penn State to the kind of modern times with, you talk about NIL and transfer portal, and just how much the college football world has changed. Since he took over as college football coach, he's had to deal with that, deal with sanctions, and also deal with upgrading facilities and making sure Penn State's competitive with those other elite programs and getting recruits in there. So.
And recruiting, the recruiting. There aren't many better than James Franklin when it comes to recruiting.
And his staff. Right. You're right, Dave. Yeah, his staff, they're doing a great job. And we'll see. I think this is it could be longer than it could be more than a 2-year window, Kenny. We'll see. But I think these 2 years could be very good ones for Penn State and its fans.
Last segment here on Good Sports podcast and web series. Ken Cara, SSPTV Sports Director, with Dave Seamon, Standard Speaker Sports Editor, and Rich Scarcella, works at the Reading Eagle, long time covering Penn State football. And while we have this opportunity talking with you, Rich, just wanted to take a look back at some Penn State memories, because you've been covering the team since 1989. So much has happened within that span. What comes to mind? Like, what were some special moments that you had? Big moments, but also maybe some little moments that you had that you really appreciated covering the Nittany Lions.
Gosh, Kenny, that's a real wide open question. I mean, I know, it's really about the relationships. I mean, I've seen great games, and I've been to, I don't remember, 20. It's in the high 20 number of bowl games. I've been to 4 Rose Bowls. I know that. And I'm very fortunate to have been there for all 4. But it's about the relationships you build with people, whether that's players, whether that's coaches, whether that's people at Penn State in their sports information / athletic communication. These are people that you spend a lot of time with, like every Saturday in the fall and then some. And but mostly it's the people on the Penn State football beat. I've made so many friends, lifetime friends on the Penn State football beat. I don't want to name any, but just they're some of my closest friends. And you just, because I think it's you go through things together, and you share a lot of highs and you share a lot of lows. We were through one of the worst scandals in college sports history, and then we've seen teams. Some of us have seen an unbeaten team, and then we've gone to so many major bowls. But they're the things that I'll remember the most. Really, are the people on the beat who like I said, I don't want to name any, but I have several of them who are friends for life.
I wanted to ask you, Richard, one of the biggest games when I was little, I remember the 1992 Miami game when they came up to Beaver Stadium. I think it was 92. And correct me if I have any of this information wrong, but I remember there being speakers on the scoreboard, and there was a big deal about Joe allowing there to be like music and speakers. Yeah. They really played this game. Miami comes in, they get the win over Penn State. That was a huge game in Beaver Stadium. Do you remember that build-up, and do you remember the speakers and all of that?
I do. There were a lot of, back then, back then I was in my 30s, and, a lot of the older fans who are my age now, they were upset. They were really upset by all the noise and the music and everything. And they I remember them complaining a lot about it to the administration. And I think Jim Tarman, 92, Jim Tarman was the athletic director then. So I remember. I remember both Miami games down at the old Orange Bowl, which is where the Marlins Stadium was built. The 91 game was it was October and it was so hot. And I remember going up in an elevator, the press box elevator with Keith Jackson and Bob Greasy, and sweat was just pouring off Keith Jackson. It was that hot. And that was the game. They almost won. It was 26-20. Tony Sacco was the quarterback, and he threw a behind the back pass. And people were like, what? And I can't remember who it was to. It may have been to a running back. And then the 99 game down at the Orange Bowl where Kevin Thompson hit Chaffee Fields for a 78-yard touchdown pass. I was on the sideline then. Miami was driving, and they went for it on 4th and 1, and they got stopped. And then on the next play, Thompson hit Fields, and I couldn't see it because we were down. We saw Thompson through the pass, and you couldn't see anything, but you could see everybody on the Penn State sidelines jumping up and down.
I thought that 99 team you mentioned, that was when I first learned in life that life is just unfair to me in that, because I was so convinced going into that season, this was my year, I'm going to see a national championship. But what a team to appreciate. I mean, I think I remember LeVar Arrington blocking a Pitt field goal, and that rivalry, just seeing that again. I just had a feeling that last second win at Miami, you thought this team has it, and then that Minnesota game I don't think I ever felt so deflated. What was it like covering that team? And there were so many expectations, and you lose 3 straight games, go to an Alamo Bowl.
Yeah, there was a lot of things going on that year. Some behind the scenes that I can't share with everybody, but I know this. I know, there was another fourth quarter lead. They had a lead on Michigan at Beaver Stadium the next week after the Minnesota game, and Tom Brady led Michigan back, beat them. And then they just they played okay at Michigan State, but then I think there was a late turnover and Michigan State held on. And so they lost their last 3 games. That defense was as good as any. You had, they get the number 1 and number 2 picks in the draft, Courtney Brown and LeVar Arrington. And you had 3 first-team All-Americans along with those 2 and Brandon Short. It was a great, great defense. And they made a goal line stand at Purdue either the week before Minnesota or there was a bye in between. I don't remember. And they held on to beat Drew Brees and Purdue. And I saw an administrator in the airport. It's a guy who's still around State College, Frank Rocco. And never forget Frank Rocco telling me in the Indianapolis airport the next morning. He goes, sometimes things happen and you kind of get a feeling. And he really thought they were going to go undefeated and go 12-0. And then obviously the next week it fell apart against Minnesota.
Rich, I wanted to ask you, I think one of the most fascinating periods of Penn State football was from maybe that 99 season to the 2005 season. You had those really, really rough years, some losing records, no bowl games, the people saying Joe Paterno must go. But you also had, around that time period, Joe reaching Bear Bryant's record, Larry Johnson, rushing for over 2,000 yards. And then, you had the whole Adam Telefaro, everything that happened with him, his injury, his comeback. And then you had the improbable run in 2005 to the Big Ten title, and Joe Paterno saying, hey, we're a few players away. What was it like going through that time period as a reporter and a beat reporter toward the end of Joe's career? I mean, I know he went on from there, but also just coming back.
I mean, it was different because the 03 season was just awful. They were 3-9, and it was just bad. And that came off. You had a losing season in 2000, 2001, and then you had they were 9-4 in 02, and then you had another losing season, and he went in 04. There was a lot of pressure on him for the first time probably in his time at Penn State, and that was the year people went to his house. They lost their first, I can't remember how many games in 04. Big Ten games, and they went to his house, basically said, looking for an exit plan, not to fire him on the spot, and he basically chased them away. And then they won that game at Indiana with that goal line stand. I'll never forget standing on the sideline there in Bloomington, and there were a lot of rumors swirling that week that he was going to be let go. and they won that game, and then they won against Michigan State to finish 4-7, I think 4-7, and then they recruited Derek Williams and Justin King and Deion Butler, even though he wasn't as highly touted as those two. And then things started to turn around, and lo and behold, they win the Big Ten championship game, and they're playing Florida State in the Orange Bowl, and they win in a real, obviously triple overtime game that was crazy. And he proved his doubters wrong, and I thought maybe that he would step away then, and he didn't. And then they came back in 6-7 and did okay, but not great. And then in 2008, he was bothered by his hip. He had the hip replacement, and he was watching games from press boxes. And then they win another share of the Big Ten title. And then the following year, they had a really nice year, but they beat LSU in the Citrus Bowl in a mudbath. And he had Darryl Clark and Sean Lee. And I'll never forget the look on his face after that game. He just looked so happy and proud of those two guys. And I thought maybe that would be it. And unfortunately, he didn't. If he had left after the 2009 season, while the scandal may have, there were still obviously, children abused, obviously, I don't think it would have been nearly as spectacular news as it was if Joe was no longer the coach. You know what I'm saying? So it was a really strange decade. It was a very, very odd decade of covering Penn State football.
Where does that 1994 offense, can you look back and still say that was one of the greatest offenses in college football, and why, or have times just changed so much?
I think there's no doubt that it was one of the, I mean, you look at the players that were drafted, 3 in the top 10 in, Kajana Carter, Kerry Collins, and Kyle Brady, if I'm not mistaken. They're all drafted in the top 10. Hardings was the top draft pick. He had a great pro career. He was the offensive line was fantastic. We go back to the offensive line. Most of those were pros for a long time. They had a lot of chemistry, and there's a grit about them too. They had the ball. They knew they were going to score, and it was, you could call it cocky if you want, but they just knew they were going to score. The perfect example of that is the Illinois game when, down by 3 points. In the rain, if you remember that game, Rich, I'm sure you do, and just watching that game, it's just like, for some reason you just knew they were going to score the ball. It was 96 yards, 5 minutes, but every play they had to make in that drive was just an embodiment of that team, and that's what was so great about that team. They scored whenever they wanted, and they did against Michigan as well. They needed a drive to win that game in Ann Arbor, and they did that. Ask any player from that era too, or who played against that team, and they would tell you the same thing, that team was an all-time team.
I think we forget sometimes. Would you agree with that, Rich?
I think they rank among the greatest offenses of all time, and it's unfortunate that they didn't get a chance to play at for a national championship. But that team is the reason that led to the bowl championship series, which led to, I forget what the next step was, the number 1 versus number 2 game, and then now the college football playoff, because Penn State never got a chance to play for the national championship. And you can argue what you want. I mean, the day that I'll never forget is they put 63 points up against a ranked Ohio State team, 63-14. Ohio State was number 17 in the country. And they dropped from 1 to 2 in one of the polls because Nebraska beat Colorado that day. I think Colorado was 2 or 3, and I forget what, it's 30 years ago now. But they dropped to 2, and then they dropped out of 1 in the AP poll when they were up by a ton at Indiana, and Indiana scored like 2 touchdowns in the last 2 minutes against Penn State reserves, and Penn State's ranking dropped. And there were Penn's Big Ten voters in the AP poll who covered Big Ten teams who dropped Penn State. And even after they beat Michigan at Michigan and crushed Ohio State, they also earlier that year crushed USC at home. I mean, and that Illinois team, the defense for Illinois had like several guys who went on to the NFL, like Simeon Rice and Dana Howard. I mean, I think are they the greatest offense of all time? I can't say that, but they're certainly one of the greatest offenses of all time.
I was going to say, Rich, I still think that team, there was a little bit of envy early. It was early in Big Ten, Penn State's Big Ten run. I think, Penn State had so much success early, and you're not supposed to be doing this to the Big Ten. You can't do this to Michigan. You can't go into Michigan and win a game the way they won it, and you can't put 63 points. I still think there was a little bit of bias there, lingering bias, and I think that was the case.
But do I think Penn State deserved the share, at least the share of the national championship? Yes. I think if I had a vote, and I've never had a vote in the top in the AP poll, if I had a vote, I would have probably maybe split it. If you can't split it, I would have certainly put Penn State one. I mean, they had really two close games all year, Michigan and Illinois, and they were both on the road and they both won. And they averaged, I think, 520 yards of offense and close to 50 points a game. And man, they were fun to cover.
Dave, anything else before we wrap up?
No, I just when we talk about, we could spend all day and all night talking about the great games and the moments. The Aaron Harris run against Ohio State in '97, and there was a buzz that day because I think Penn State was ranked number 2 in the country at the time, and Ohio State was ranked number 7, and it was a perfect day at Beaver Stadium, late afternoon. What I remember most about, we were all writing our stories at the time, and I was covering games at the time, is just you heard a roar go up. Sometime LSU had just knocked off Florida. Florida was number 1. It's like, what is that like? It was just like a roar, but it's just the excitement level of college football, and to get to experience that, like every week too. It's such a high, and Rich is among the best at doing that, and for so many years.
I want to wrap things up because we're out of time here. And I'm Rich, if you could think of something, I didn't tell you this before. I always forget to tell our guests this, but we always close our show with a good sports moment, something in the sports world that made us, love our jobs or say, hey, this is what it's all about. Dave, you could start with your good sports moment.
My good sport moment. I'm going to go away from the Penn State scene for a moment. I'm going to talk about Jim Burns, the District 18 Little League administrator. He just again supervised 3 tournaments. Again, does a fantastic job keeping us updated on everything at the Standard Speaker. It's a well-run tournament, and he had to do it. Unfortunately, this year his wife passed during the tournament too. But Jim was there every night calling, and just a good man, and I enjoy working with him, and he's my good sport.
Yeah, Jim Burns always did a great job. And speaking of loving what we do, Dave, I always think it's cool watching you cover these big things, and then I see you at Little League, and you're just as into it and just as intense when you're covering that. My good sport goes to Ashley Bueso. She was the District 2 AAA champion in the shot put for the Hazleton area track and field team this season, and I was so happy to do a big feature story on her for Out of Left Field on SSPTV. And I really wanted to do it, Dave, because she was the Athlete of the Week in the Standard Speaker, and her answers to all of your questions, they just beamed joy. Like, I was smiling reading the article, and I thought, I really want to talk with Ashley, and she had that personality. She inspired me. We talk about how the athletes inspire us. She talked about her journey and how she uses, so often you hear athletes say, oh, I like to get mad. I have to go out there and get motivated. And she was like, I have to be smiling. I have to, I have to be enjoying myself. And if you get a chance, watch that interview. Read the interview in the Standard Speaker as well, because I think you'll be inspired as well. She's a great young woman. She has a great outlook on life. And really, really interesting interview. She's also great at calculus, which we talked about a lot, and also has an artistic side as well. So just a great, well-rounded person, and someone you could be proud representing the Hazleton area. Rich, I know we kind of tossed this on you, so if you don't have anything, that's fine. But do you kind of have a good sport moment to share with us?
A good sport moment for me is Journey Brown. That he is, he's engaged to be married next year. He's, out of his, funk that he was in for a year and a half, and he's training to be a member of he's training with the NASCAR team, the Trackhouse Racing. And he was at Pocono this weekend. I didn't get to see him, but because we don't cover racing anymore. But the fact that he has moved on with his life and that he has a goal in mind, he's trying to become a full-time crew member with Trackhouse. I really feel good about that.
And your Journey brand story ran, so people could find this on the Reading Eagles website. And
they can, and it's also going to be in the Town and Gown Football Annual.
Absolutely cannot wait for that. I pride myself usually in keeping us right at an hour with this podcast, Dave. I think we're almost at 2 now. So, Rich, I apologize if we kept you, but I really enjoyed this conversation, both about, because I love Penn State, but also just hearing some of the local stories from Hazleton as well. And you're just a pleasure to talk with, Rich. Thank you for sharing your talent with everybody and also your time here today. We appreciate it.
You've been listening to Good Sports with Dave and Ken, brought to you by SSPTV and the Hazleton Standard Speaker.